Dear America, Across the Wide and Lonesome Prairie, The Oregon Trail Diary of Hattie Campbell, 1847, by Christiana Gregory. I asked tall Joe why they was begging. They ain't begging, he said. Indians are hospitable people, and if they was passing through our land, they'd give us a gift. They're just asking for ours. They look like beggars to me, but they're not making trouble. Matter of fact, one of the women did something real nice. She saw Mrs. Anderson off by herself, crying, and walked over to her with a square of deerskin, the size of a plate. On it was several chunks of cooked meat. She picked up a piece and put it to Mrs. Anderson's lips, nodding for her to eat. The woman then pointed to the little Anderson girls playing in the stream, then motioned with her hands and mouth like she was eating. Finally, Mrs. Anderson accepted the gift. I think she understood that the Indian women wanted her to take nourishment for the sake of her little daughters. Later. Aunt June wears a smock dress now on account she's getting bigger. I helped her and Ma do laundry. The stream was busy with ladies talking and working. By afternoon the bushes were covered with petticoats, shirts, calicoes, blankets, all drying in the hot sun. The youngest children ran naked into the water. Pepper and I loosened our braids and stripped down to our camisoles and then jumped in too. How good the cold water felt pouring over my face and through my hair, and how good it felt to wash away the dust. We swam downstream along the bank where willows made a canopy of shade. It was shallow enough to sit on the sandy bottom, the water up to our shoulders. Ma don't know this, but we then took off our drawers and camisoles until we was bare as the day we were born. Reckless with joy, we dove below the surface to stare at each other through the bubbles. It was several minutes before we realized our clothes was floating downstream beyond our reach, down in the direction of the men and boys. Pepper and I soon learned it ain't easy to walk upstream crouched down so only your head is above water. Also, it's near impossible to swim without your bare backside showing. We was rescued by two grandmothers holding blankets for us. There is dancing again tonight. Ma still refuses to join in. Pepper was fetched by Gideon, and this time he held her hand all the way through camp. Oh, yes, a little baby girl was born this morning at Ash Hollow. Another thing, that fat lady came over and brung Ma fresh pie, mince it turns out. I hurried off to watch from the trees. She must eat 10 pies a day, I reckon. She's that huge. Next day. In the far distance, the prairie and low hills are black. I thought that must have been a fire, but tall Joe said, "Nope, it's just buffalo. Thousands and thousands of 'em." After supper, I sat by the fire to mend Benny's blanket. He lay next to me in the dirt talking about this and that, then suddenly he was fast asleep. I like the way he folds into my arms when I carry him to bed. Later. We are starting to find buffalo droppings, and tall Joe says, "Where there's bluffs, there's Injuns." Hunters leave the wagons every morning to look for game. They brung down 2 buffalo near enough to the trail so folks can see 'em being skinned and butchered. Jake went with some older boys to watch, but I stayed behind. Aunt June was resting in her wagon with Olive and Laurel, who are 3 and 4 years old. To make room inside, Uncle Tim pulled out several sacks of bacon and flour. It is so much work to pack and unpack that at noon Pa just lies flat in the dirt to rest, and he's sound asleep before his eyes even close. We're camped next door to Aunt June with the tarp stretched between the tops for shade. I saw Mrs. Canker wave howdy. "Hattie, dear," she said, "may I borrow one of your mother's tablecloths, please? Mine is soiled, and Mr. Canker is ready for his lunch." I felt stiff toward her. "I'm afraid not, Mrs. Canker." My aunt's voice came from her wagon. "Hattie Campbell, we are not a family to refuse hospitality. Help Mrs. Canker take what she needs." Well, by the time Mrs. Canker has snooped around, we were quite a bit lighter. She took our lovely lace tablecloth that grandmother made, 5 doilies, a tea cozy, and 1 English teacup. She also grabbed one of Ma's calico brown skirts and draped it over her arm, but I snatched it back. Our eyes locked, then she finally turned away. "Thank you, dear," she called over her shoulder, her arms too full to wave. Jake was so excited to tell about the buffalo skinning, and he pulled my hand to go see, but I was bothered about Mrs. Canker and wouldn't. When Ma came back, I told her, but she said the same thing as Aunt June. We must share. This makes me mad. I like to share with nice folks, not those that take advantage. I'm afraid if I say anything more about Mrs. Canker, I'll sound wretched, so that's all for now. Later again. There are more and more buffalo. There are so many, the herds look like a dark stain moving over the hills. The droppings are flat, full of dried grass, and make good coals, but it takes near a bushel to make a decent cooking fire. I'd rather pick up twigs and logs than buffalo dung, but this is what we must do. As long as they're not fresh and gooey, it ain't so bad. The boys, including my naughty brother Jake, spend much of their chore time throwing these buffalo chips at each other like a snowball fight instead of helping. They also think it's fun to ambush us girls, but I think it's nasty. Pepper and I feel nervous when we go out to gather the chips. The other day 2 horsemen were watching from a distance, so we told our fathers, who told the rest of the men. Now they all ride with loaded guns. It scares me to think Indians are following us. Maybe Indian women are nice, but the men carry weapons. I do not trust them. I walk alongside Wade's wagon with Pepper. She and I sing to him Yankee Doodle and other songs. We feel silly, but maybe he'll wake up. He's swallowing the broth she spoons into his mouth, and his arms no longer shake or stiffen. Mrs. Lewis and her friends look in on him constantly, and I will say he's the most prayed-over boy I ever met. Evening. The sun is scorching hot. Ma insists I wear my bonnet to protect my face, but the cloth itches my scalp. When Pepper and I are out walking, we carry them like baskets to gather flowers. It feels cooler to let the wind blow my hair back, and besides, I think boys like looking at us better without them. The Mormons are still on the north side of the Platte. Sometimes all we see is their dust because they move faster. Ma says it's because they're traveling with just 2 children instead of 200, like we have in our train. Babies slow things up. That's just the way it is, she says. I told Ba that Brigham Young must be very religious because he makes his people rest on the Sabbath, no traveling. Pa laughed. He said, I still ain't in agreement with Brigham Young's theology, but if he wants to rest on the Sabbath, good for him. But Hattie, don't judge a man only by how strict he keep rules. Tall Joe said that up here soon the routes will meet at Fort Laramie, and like it or not, we'll be traveling alongside the Mormons and their 73 wagons. Pepper and I plan to meet the 2 children. Later. There is much celebration today and tears of joy. After 3 days of sleeping, Wade sat up, looked around, and said, Mother, I'm hungry as a bear. Just like that. Pepper and I joined hands with Gideon and the little Anderson girls and Jake and Benny. We danced around Wade's wagon and sang. Mrs. Lewis cries and cries. She's so thankful to God for healing her son. He is too weak to walk, but his father carried him down to the river's edge to a sandy beach. He bathed him, then helped him dress into clean clothes. Now Wade's sitting in the shade wearing a blue shirt and pants. I am so glad to see his beautiful green eyes again. Pepper can't stop giggling, she's so happy. She sits by her brother just talking and talking to him. Another day. Clouds build up like white towers, then in the afternoon they turn black. Near every day we hear the low rumblings of thunder, and we feel heavy drops of rain, enough to settle the dust and coat the wheels with mud, but no downpour. We see mighty herds of buffalo in the distance to either side of the trail. Often there are men on horseback moving along a ridge. If the Indians are following us, they're keeping their distance. Maybe they're just curious and don't plan to murder us. This morning I read back through this journal and laughed when I saw what I'd written about Boonville. I'm only afraid of 4 things. Ma said that people who are thinkers often change their opinions. It means you're growing. So here's what I think. Some things I was afraid of, I'm not afraid of now, and the other way around. I'm not so scared about snakes anymore. I have not had a toothache, and the Indians haven't hurt us. Even Benny and Jake don't worry me so much. They are much stronger on their legs and stay close to the wagon. So here is my new list. 1. I'm afraid of hemlock. 2. Fast rivers. That's all. Later. Wade walked today for about 15 minutes. He steps slow and gets tired easy. When we ask if he remembers what happened, he squints and looks up at the sky. Nope, he says after a while. He knows we're on our way to Oregon, and he does remember being on a riverboat some time ago. He knows his family, and today he said my name. He said, "Hattie, your cheeks are sunburned." Then he smiled at me. At noon we sat by a stream where it was shady. Aunt June and Mrs. Anderson have become close friends, and the four girls are like having my very own sisters again. Ma helps care for baby Eliza May. We were cooling our feet in the water when we heard loud voices arguing. Two men were yelling words I can't repeat. I ran through the grass and saw Mr. Canker with the pistol pointed at Tall Joe, and there was Mrs. Canker, her hands on her hips, also yelling. Tall Joe yanked off his beaver hat and threw it to the dirt. 15 miles a day is what we'll do, like it or not, he said, his face 2 inches away from Mr. Canker's. Spit came out, he was so mad. "And the next time you point a gun at me, mister, I'll slice your ears off. Don't you forget." Mrs. Canker piped in. "How dare you speak to my husband that way? We're just poor old people looking to start a new life, and you're nothing but a liar who stinks to high heaven. I don't know why we ever let you be the leader." Tall Joe's eyes narrowed. "And you," he said, pointing his finger at her, "you bother me worse than a corpse on a hot day." He grabbed Mr. Canker's pistol and aimed it at their wagon seat where a pie was cooling. The first shot made the pan spin. The second splattered it. Mrs. Canker's hands flew up in shock, and what she screamed at Tall Joe, I ain't repeating that either. Pa later told us that the Cankers have been pestering Tall Joe to slow down because they are plumb wore out. The mister has something wrong with his backside, so it hurts him to sit so many hours driving their team, and she don't like the bugle at 4 o'clock every morning, and there's too many crying children, and so on, one complaint after another. I was upset to see old people yelled at. They must be 50 years of age. Even though I don't trust Mrs. Canker, she sometimes still reminds me of my grandmother, the way she looks, I mean. Last week in May, thereabouts. In the far distance we can see something poking up from the horizon, like a thumb pointing at the clouds. Tall Joe says this is Chimney Rock. It's the closest thing to a mountain that I've ever seen. The woman who had a baby back in Ash Hollow died of fever this morning. She was buried on a bluff overlooking the valley. Her newborn daughter is being cared for by another mother, and friends are helping the father with his 3 little boys. Chimney Rock. For 2 long days we approached Chimney Rock. It seemed to take forever. 2 evenings we watched the sunset behind it as we ate supper. Now that we're here, it's a curious sight. A huge pile of rocks with what looks like a stone chimney rising up from its center. Jake and several boys hiked around its base and counted 10,000 steps. I don't know how they kept track of so many numbers, but they did. Tall Joe said some other folks counted years past, and they also said 10,000. Boys with rifles are shooting at the top of Chimney Rock to see what will happen. They like the fuss and noise. Now some families have souvenir chips tucked in their wagons. The plains are dry with no trees. We are slowly moving toward the Pacific Ocean, but it's near impossible for me to picture a sea other than the sea of grass. All around is open space with colors of gold, green, and brown. I feel we are specks like bugs crawling across a kitchen floor. It is very pretty, but I miss the sight and smell of trees, and I do miss my Missouri River. To think I might never hear again the long, high whistle of a steamboat makes me feel lonesome. Scott's Bluff. I have never seen a real castle, but today we passed what Pa says looks like one. On the side of the trail high above us rose a sharp wall of stone called Scott's Bluff. Jake wanted to climb up when he saw some older boys trying, but Ma held his shirt and said, "No." The bluff hugs the river so close we had to steer the wagons aside and pull around it up a rocky ridge. Tall Joe said this place was named after the fur trader Hiram Scott, who got sick and was abandoned by his companions. He crawled 60 miles trying to find them. When the trappers came this way again, they found a skeleton, what was left of his boots, right here. This morning, after we were on the trail for an hour, a boy playing with his father's gun accidentally shot our front ox in the head. It dropped dead so quick the ones behind stumbled onto it, and what a tangle of hooves and harnesses. Pa was so mad he stormed over to the boy, grabbed the gun, and threw it into the river. "You could have killed one of my children, young man." I have never seen Pa so red in the face. I ran to Jake and Benny, even though I knew they were safe, and gathered them to me like I was an old hen. That boy made me so mad that after supper I marched over and kicked him hard in the leg, twice. 60 miles until we reach Fort Laramie, 4 days if we push. Later. Thunder and lightning with heavy winds. Rain turned to sleet, then hail. I scolded Jake for throwing hailstones at another boy who ran to his mama crying. Fort Laramie. When Fort Laramie drew into sight, I felt shaky. Indians were camped everywhere, but I looked at them careful and did not see any trouble brewing. They were mostly families, seemed like. Tall Joe said we're now in the middle of Sioux country, and this is the biggest trading post around. It's built from logs and is owned by the American Fur Company. There were dozens of trappers and mountain men dressed in beaded leather and skins and living in teepees. Many seem to be married to Indian women, for there are half-breed children playing among the tents. We're staying for 2 nights and 1 full day, so folks can make repairs on wagons and buy supplies. A Frenchman runs this place. Way on the other side of the river we can see Brigham Young's camp. The trail, such as it is, ends, so they must cross to our side. The Frenchman has a flatboat. For $15 he'll ferry their wagons across. $15 is a fortune. But Pa says the river is deeper here, so it's probably worth it for them to pay. We were already on the trail again before the Mormons had crossed over, so I reckon they'll be traveling in our dust. There are signposts every few miles. There are messages written on pieces of board stuck in the sand. Also, there are buffalo skulls with writing on them. Some notes are impossible to read because the sun has bleached out the ink or rain has smeared it. There are warnings of bad water, rattlesnakes, and danger, like this one. Willie Henderson and 2 others died here June 1846, buffalo stampede. Early June. Aunt June feels poorly. Ma says it's just weariness. She needs to rest and to drink more water. I asked when her baby will be born because she walks slower and her middle is bigger by the day, it seems. Soon, Hattie, in a few weeks. Mr. Lewis's mules are gone. Sometime in the night they were stolen from their pickets, their ropes cut. Injuns, he said, shaking his head with worry. We gave him one of our oxen, now we have 4. Uncle Tim did also, so now Mr. Lewis has a team of 2. The Mormons passed us today while we were nooning. Tall Joe pointed out Brigham Young on horseback. He was wearing a black hat, and he lifted his arm to wave, then galloped ahead. Pepper and I stood on our wagon seat and shaded our eyes, hoping to see the Mormon children, but we saw only dust. Someone said that just one wife is with him. All the others are back in Illinois. Register Cliff. The trail goes through limestone, which is soft when wet. Pepper and I carved our names into a boulder by the side of the road using a sharp stone. Our hands grew tired, so we didn't spell out our full names or hometowns. During the long, hot hours of the day, many of the men driving wagons dozed, their reins in hand. It's a wonder none have fallen off the seats. Paul looks wore out. Yesterday a wasp stung him on his neck and it is swollen up. Ma keeps dabbing mud on, but it's still sore and red. We are so tired by nightfall. We roll into our blankets and stretch out on the hard ground, lately not using tents. It means one less thing to unpack and repack every day. The breeze is cool on my face. How I wish I could keep my eyes open long enough to study the stars, but suddenly it's morning. The bugle has sounded and campfires smell of fresh coffee. Afternoon. Pepper told me a secret last night. We were setting up a tent to share with little Holly and Laurel, for there was thunder and the smell of rain. It was pitch black, no moon or stars. Every minute or so a sheet of lightning flashed in the west, so bright we could see the whole prairie, the way it is when someone holds up a lantern in a barn. For 2 full seconds we could see each other, then it was dark again. After we tucked ourselves into blankets, Holly and Laurel already asleep between us, Pepper whispered, "Gideon has asked me to marry him, and I said yes. Tell me what you think, Hattie." "Well, Pepper, I'm real happy for you." But what I didn't tell her was that I was filled with envy. How I wanted to have someone love me too. If she is 14 and old enough to marry, then at 13 I'm old enough to fall in love. We whispered until the rain began hitting our tent and we could no longer hear one another. It rained all night. Pepper and I moved closer and held the little girls against us so they wouldn't be cold. Thunder rocked the ground as if horses were running by. Water seeped under our tent and up into our blankets. I did not sleep a wink on account of being wet and chilled.